Well, welcome everyone to this DiploLab co-hosted by the Open Diplomacy Institute and the Canadian Embassy in Paris. As you all know, this is the second DiploLab we have in a series of 5 conversations around the era we are ushering in along the COVID crisis. We have been speaking about shaking Africa last week. We are speaking about weakening multilateralism tonight. And we will be speaking soon about developing disinformation, increasing gender violence, and collapsing international trade. Obviously, these are serious questions and serious conversation because we are facing times of troubles. So it's easier, much easier to think through these ideas and these issues with friends than enemies. This is why I'm happy to cooperate with the Canadian Embassy in Paris tonight. As you all know, this is a long-lasting partnership that we have with the embassy. It is deeply rooted in the Canadian presidency of the G7 back in 2018, as Canada has made significant steps forward to let young leaders step up in G7 conversations. It was amplified in 2019 during the French presidency of the G7. As France has tried to keep up with the Canadian efforts to lead the conversation, specifically about gender equality, and this is why we're committed to a Franco-Canadian dialogue over these cross-cutting issues. Before starting the panel, I would like to introduce you to our panelists. Surprisingly, we are not speaking tonight in French, but in English, which is another common language that we French have in common with Canada, and that's obviously a good pick to speak about multilateralism. And this is mostly explained by our panel. I'm happy to host tonight 3 prominent speakers. Let me introduce you to Dr. Anne Kratz. Thank you, Anne, for being with us. Anne is a Franco-American. She's an historian specialized about international trade cooperation, and she today is senior fellow at the Open Diplomacy Institute. Thank you, Han, for being with us.
You're welcome.
I'm also happy to host Colin Robertson. Colin is Canadian. Thank you, Colin, for being with us. You're a career diplomat with an extensive experience in the US-Canada relationships, especially in trade issues, and you're serving today as the Vice President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Thank you, Colin, for being with us tonight. And let me also introduce you to Leslie Vignamuri. Leslie is American. She's a social scientist with a global track record of research in the most prestigious academic institutions from both sides of the Atlantic. And she's today the director of the US and Americas program in the Chatham House, as well as the dean of the Queen Elizabeth II Academy. Thank you, Leslie, for being with us tonight. Before getting to the pressing issues we are addressing tonight, let me call for Mrs. Isabelle Hudon, the ambassador of Canada in Paris, to start our conversation. Dear Isabelle, the floor is yours.
Merci, merci beaucoup, Thomas. Very glad to join all of you, and I'll do as we do in Canada with being bilingual. So, Thomas, you will allow me to say a few words in French for our audience. That is probably mainly French, but also totally bilingual. Alors, ça me fait vraiment, vraiment plaisir de collaborer à nouveau avec Open Diplomacy. Vraiment, c'est pour moi une grande découverte depuis que je suis à Paris, et merci à mes collègues et particulièrement à Tristan Landry au sein de mon équipe qui m'a exposé et introduit à la fois à l'organisation mais également à son leader en la présence de Thomas. À un moment où nous sommes bousculés avec cette crise et que nous reconnaissons devoir se réinventer et chercher des moyens de se réinventer. La diplomatie ne fait pas exception. On doit à la fois non pas réinventer la diplomatie parce que on sait très bien quelle est la mission première de la diplomatie, mais nous devons nous réinventer sur la livraison de notre mission. Et je suis extrêmement fière de ce partenariat avec Open Diplomacy, avec ces laboratoires virtuels, avec vous, experts et expertes, qui acceptez de joindre vos réflexions à une réflexion collective pour nous faire avancer. Ces laboratoires, cette série de DiploLabs, on a voulu la signer, cette série sur la crise de COVID-19. We feel that we need to think outside of the box. We feel that we need all of you to help us on thinking about what we should do more, what we should do less, what we should do differently. But one thing is sure is from a Canadian perspective, and I think that I can speak on behalf of Open Diplomacy and all of you, multilateralism is non-negotiable. And even if some countries are not there anymore or questioning if multilateralism should continue, we do strongly believe in Canada in multilateralism. That being said, we also recognize that any organization needs to reinvent and find new ways to do things and deliver its mission. I just want to state the fact that I'm pretty sure that I don't have to convince all of you that Canada is at the table of multilateralism. But I feel that in honor of my country and all efforts being delivered by our Prime Minister Trudeau, and all cabinet ministers, and also my colleagues at in Ottawa, I feel that I should mention that we were quick, Canada, of course, to manage the crisis from a domestic perspective, but also to support international actions. We've supported the WHO, we've supported, and we're still there every day at the United Nations, the World Bank. We were fast, quick and strong on supporting the UN Secretary General Guterres for the global ceasefire. I think that it was amazing that so quick, right at the get-go of that crisis, that global call was made, and we were proud to be beside Secretary Guterres. Also, from a bilateral perspective between France and Canada, we're often visible together, we're often aligned, and we are pretty proud, again, to be beside France and to see France beside Canada to support the crisis with the global, probably you saw the global pledge that was made by a number of countries, EU countries, and Canada was there also, and of course with France. So Anne, Colin, and Leslie, I'm pretty sure that you'll be quick in thinking outside of the box. I hope that you will bring new ideas, fresh ideas, that you will challenge all participants, and I'm pretty sure that you will challenge each other. And Thomas, c'est toujours un grand plaisir de collaborer avec toi et ton organisation. Je vous souhaite donc de fructueuses réflexions et conversations. Merci.
Merci beaucoup Isabelle. Pour tous ceux qui n'ont pas la chance d'être là ce soir, il y aura une vidéo récapitulative et un compte-rendu qui sera produit. Donc pas de crainte pour partager encore plus largement ces réflexions. I'm happy to have this discussion tonight around our three speakers, also in the presence of many of our fellows and Y7 or Y20 delegates. as well as senior members of the organizations sitting at our board. I'm speaking about Annick Cizel, who is a professor at the Paris 3 Sorbonne Nouvelle University and specialized about these issues. We have organized together a powerful event early January about the consequences of diplomatic style of Trump on these issues, and I'm happy to see that this cooperation with the Sorbonne Nouvelle University is long-lasting with your presence tonight, Annick. So let me turn to our panelists, but before that, reminding a bit of the rules that we will be observing tonight. The DiploLab will roll out as follows. We will have a 45-minute panel discussion that I will lead, and then a 30-minute Q&A session with the participants. Feel free to start from now asking the questions you may have on the chat of our platform during the panel discussion that will facilitate the Q&A session afterwards. Let's start now our panel discussion. I will address my questions to the three of you each time, and then maybe pick up some more specifics along the conversation, if I may. My first question goes as this. We've seen that China has obviously misled the WHO in managing the crisis for some political reasons, which has implied that the US is now stepping down from the one only global agency able to coordinate world's research efforts to find a vaccine as soon as possible. What I'm asking, is this the only new episode in the show of the Beijing-Washington Cold Wars, or is it a dangerous sign of multilateralism dying? Maybe starting with Anne and Leslie first, and then Anne to have more background.
Well, it's a sign of an evolution that was already beginning to take place some years ago, even, I might add, just a little bit before Trump came into office, of a new sort of animosity towards China, justified or not. Some people would say it is justified, but this is not today's debate. I personally think it is rather a grave mistake on the part of the United States to have attacked China in this fashion within the WHO, because the WHO as a multilateral organization is definitely necessary to the resolution of this worldwide crisis. It has worldwide reach, and for the United States to have withdrawn its funding just a day after the G20 had reaffirmed its support of the WHO is rather deplorable. I believe that it's possible that, in fact, several prominent voices in the United States, among Democrats, but even among other more conservative politicians, have raised their voices against this move very publicly. So that, I think, answers that part of your question.
Sure. Colin, do you share the point of view of Anne that this crisis is long-lasting and deeply rooted in events that were happening before Trump was elected? Or is it only an amplifying crisis since Trump has moved into office?
I think Trump is singular, and he has taken a strain of American isolationism and nativism to a level we have never seen before, at least not since the creation of the rules-based international order, which successive American presidents from Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman were responsible for first the creation and then sustaining. Now, Trump is singular, and he has chosen to vilify multilateralism, and it's not just the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization is just the latest victim in his list. It's the United Nations generally. It's the World Trade Organization. I think that this is now part of his campaign. Obviously, the vilification of China enters into this, and the Chinese make it easier for him to do so. They're there are probably faults with the World Health Organization, but I think the approach that we've taken in the past and Americans have taken, not always so, because we've got to remember the Americans have pulled out of things like UNESCO and out of the Council or the Commission and then the Council of Human Rights. But I think that the approach for countries like Canada and France has to be to try and repair it, like what Canada is doing now with like-minded, including France, at the World Trade Organization in terms of dispute settlement. You know, it's reform institutions, don't rubbish them, because as the ambassador pointed out at the outset, for countries like Canada and France, multilateralism is really underwritten our prosperity, both because of through trade in particular, but also how we do business as countries. And in a sense, we've set the norms, but those norms are now being challenged, not just by China and Russia, but by the creator of these rules-based norms, the United States, under the leadership of Donald Trump. Happily, as Anne points out, you know, that there's divisions in the United States, but don't look for redress even if Joe Biden wins in November. I think the game has changed, but it underlines, again, what the ambassador said at the outset, that we are going to have to truly double down and work collaboratively to make multilateralism work.
Can I just?
I mean, we will get back to the U.S. Issue right after I ask this question to Leslie, and I'll circle back to Anne. Leslie, do you think that again, this is a dangerous sign of multilateralism's dying, or it's only a new episode in the wars between Washington and Beijing?
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly, we have seen this now for three, and there are many different questions, but on a couple of things. First is, this particular administration is singular in its dislike and disregard of multilateralism, and that, as we all know, is not new. But I think what we are shocked to see is that in a context where we have such a deep, grave, and broad global crisis that's live and that clearly calls for cooperation, it's shocking and unsettling to see that so far hasn't been a game changer for the White House to reach out and forge links and invest in a collaborative health and economic response. So I think we're shocked that in this context that hasn't changed. I think it was sort of easy to be anti-multilateralist when the stakes were low, but the stakes are very, very high. Secondly, I would differentiate between, you know, the White House and the United States. The China issue was big, to answer your first question, but remember that Trump had dialed it down. He'd come up with this temporary solution that he was going to stay with to keep tariffs off the table and to keep a recession off the table until he got through those November elections. So this has changed his attitude towards China. Actually, it's made it much worse. And if you look at the political campaigns that the Democrats are running right now, they're actually attacking Trump for having been easy on China in the early days of the coronavirus. But my suspicion, and I'll just put this out there for now, we can come back to it, is that in the medium term, this will drive more multilateralism, even on the part of the United States. And I think that if we go a layer below the White House and below the formal multilateral organizations, which I agree are critical, we do see a huge amount of transnationalism taking place. We see, and some of it's through official public actors at the level of cities, right? The C40 that has been chaired by the LA Mayor Garcetti, has reached out not only to coordinate on sharing personal protective equipment, but also to talk about any other number of things related to the pandemic response. It was building on an environmental initiative, and it's morphed into a response to the pandemic. And there are, as we know, any number of initiatives between businesses and the scientific community to collaborate, even between the US and China, on a response to the vaccine. So there's a high politics layer of this, which is devastating and debilitating. But I suspect that even if the Trump administration, if Trump is reelected, which I don't think he will be, that would be my reading of it. Even if he is reelected, I think we'll see actually more multilateral initiatives, because the US will decide that it's in its interests, especially if a vaccine is discovered in Europe or in Oxford and not in the US.
Thank you, Leslie. You've pointed out how dependent we are on US politics on the long run and on the short run because of this political campaign happening now. And I'm turning back to you, asking this. Because of this US politics dependency, are we likely to see other UN bodies collapsing because of the US political tensions? Is there a chance that that another multilateral body is the victim of these tensions?
Well, you know, a number of UN bodies were in danger of collapsing, have been in danger of collapsing. Colin mentioned UNESCO that the United States withdrew from a number of years ago and then eventually came back and so on and so forth. So the nature of those organizations is that they are forever shaking on their foundations, but they're basically earthquake proof, because if they didn't exist, you would have to reinvent them again. But we have now a new organization which has, it seems to me, which shows great promise. And I'm thinking of the Alliance for Multilateralism, which was founded by the French and the German, and which now includes, I don't know how many countries. And I think it's possible that in the case of the COVID-19 crisis, which is the topic of our debate tonight, it might be extremely well placed to do something about this, because what we'll need for this crisis is not so much a totally uniform and universal solution, because there's too many differences. Even though the crisis affects everybody, the very name pandemic means it affects everybody everywhere. But there are too many diverse, even cultural traditions, access to different medical systems, and so on and so forth. So, although we need a global solution, we do not need a solution that is universally applicable. We need a solution that will be differentiated according to those various elements, those various differences. And for that, we need a flexible organization, something that is maybe not quite yet as bureaucratic as any of the UN organizations, although the WHO will remain absolutely indispensable. There's no question of that. And it seems to me that the Alliance for Multilateralism could function as a sort of cooperative, collaborative hub, even if it's just for the coordination of data, because, you know, to solve this crisis, we'll need data, and also for eventually the promotion of the idea that if and when there's a vaccine that is found or other therapies, the vaccine will be made, if not available, if not free of charge, at least at minimal cost, to everyone who needs it everywhere. And for this, because of the United States' constant emphasis on the law of the market, we need someone outside of the United States. And I'm sure, as Leslie said, there are a number of organizations in the United States that would very willingly participate in that outside of the federal government. And in fact, I think the solution to many of our problems lie in those direct contacts between multilateral organizations and even governments and organizations within the US that are not totally dependent on the federal government.
Okay. Colin, do you believe that this new political constraints we are seeing now around global cooperation will give a chance to the new shape of multilateralism that Anne has been describing? Do you think that new kind of political hubs is likely to happen and include the US?
Yes, I do, and I think that, well, but I would first of all say that it's a bit sad. I think the Alliance for Multilateralism is necessary, but it's only necessary because it's a reflection of the failure of, first of all, the UN and the UN Security Council that have failed the Guterres test of meeting what Secretary General Guterres said was the biggest challenge since the creation of these institutions. I think it's also a reflection of failure of the G20. Certainly, the health ministers don't seem to be able to get the act together, in part because the United States wants to condemn China. And I don't think the G7 has performed very well. Now, you can argue that this is in part because the leadership of the G20 is held first by the Saudis, and I'm not sure they're up to it. And the G7 leadership this year is with Donald Trump. And we know where, as Anne and others have said, where Mr. Trump comes on multilateralism. And, we saw when the foreign ministers met, they couldn't come up with something. So that's, we create new institutions in the absence of the purpose-built institutions. And I look a little bit what's been happening in the World Trade Organization, where in recent years we've seen, because the WTO, the Doha round is now in year 20, so we've seen the growth of regional and plurilateral trade agreements. I think of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Canada-Europe trade agreement. We do these because the purpose-built institutions aren't working, so we have to adapt. And I think that's, especially if you believe in multilateralism, that's what we have to do. But it is a shame that we have to create these new institutions because the purpose-built ones aren't performing. That's
right. Colin, let me turn the second series of questions to Leslie based on the points you've touched upon. The presidency of the G7 is now under the US responsibility. G20 will be next year under the US presidency, while next year we will have a G7 hosted by the UK in 2021. Which is why I'm going to ask Leslie, who has two eyes on both sides of the Atlantic, on how she reads this exercise of the G7, G20 presidencies. We've seen that Beijing is now no more credible to lead multilateral institutions. Its mass diplomacy has failed because it was too aggressive. Washington today cannot be plausible leader either because its commander-in-chief believes in swallowing bleach to prevent the pandemic. So where can we seek for leadership to guide us through this global crisis? Who is able to speak up? Is it the UK?
I mean, you've certainly put your finger on the core of the problem, which is that the two countries that need to lead, two of the countries that do need to lead, are two countries that have been hit the hardest, in part by a failure of a rational, rapid, coherent response in the early days to the crisis. So even setting aside the question of their commitment prior to the pandemic to multilateralism, right? Both countries have been turning inward. They are now facing extraordinary numbers. There are 73,000 Americans that have died in the last 2 months. I mean, it's very, very sad, and it's shocking, and it's not over. I think it's around 30,000 in the UK, much smaller population, and 30 million Americans have filed for unemployment benefits. It's not possible to understate the gravity of this crisis. So even with the best will in the world, the best governments in the world, we would have two nations in the US and the UK that would be intensely focused on responding to the needs of their people at home. And that would take their eye off the ball, even if they were trying to do both simultaneously, for the very obvious reason that is their first and foremost responsibility. The problem, of course, in a pandemic is that you can't do that, and you certainly can't solve the economic crisis by shutting your borders permanently, drawing down on citizenship, et cetera. So the necessity for any government, I don't care who leads the United States of America, restricting citizenship, shutting down your borders, stopping immigration will run out of steam as soon as your corporates that are going to drive any economic recovery want those people to come in and work. So it's going to change. Do you have the right format for it? You're walking right into the November question. And things are, and we can't answer this question with any degree of certainty, but it won't be a small change. If it changes in the US from January 20th, 12:01, right after, Americans eat lunch and before Brits do, or after Brits do, because it's 5 hours later, it's going to change. And a lot of people say, well, Europe won't be very interested because America's been so absent, and not only absent, but negative and a block. And I don't buy it. I think that it won't be easy. It isn't the same. but I think that the world will actually welcome a change of administration that reaches out and isn't easier on China, is probably tougher on China, but wants to do everything through partnership with Europe. And that really will be, if it turns out to be a change of administration, it won't be perfect, but that will be the starting point for negotiating and working, will be a reinvestment in multilateral institutions, and especially in the transatlantic partnership.
Thank you, Leslie, for this specifics on the U.S. potential leadership after the elections. I'd like to turn back to Colin about this question to ask for a Canadian outlook on the situation. Your friends in the UK or in the US are stuck into politics and looking at domestic stakes and not at global leadership. Canada is in kind of the same position, since Trudeau is now leading with a minority government. Is there a chance that at some point Canada steers the game back, as it has tried to do during the G7 presidency of the Charlevoix summit 2 years ago?
Steers the game back to sort of the focus on what we did there, which is climate and gender. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's what I mean, and also take some new forms of leadership. Canada is now a bit more reluctant to invest its political leadership outside of the country because it's governed by a minority government. Is there a chance that this changes at some point?
Well, I think the minority pressures on the Prime Minister obviously oblige him simply for survival reasons to pay more attention to the domestic situation. But I think this, they say every leader needs a crisis, and I think Mr. Trudeau has now met the crisis. And if you look at the public opinion polls, he's perceived to have done very well. Now, he does this in part like with other leaders. They're dominating the news every day because we're in this extraordinary situation. I don't think it will change his outlook towards the world, his conviction and belief in multilateralism. We don't have a new conservative leader yet, but generally, an American ambassador once put it to me this way, that if the United States goes from A to Z, or we would say Z, Canadians go from F to M. And so the center for Canada is where most people are comfortable, whether you're a conservative, liberal, NDP, or Bloc Québécois. So I don't think the Canadian orientation and the emphasis on multilateralism will change whether Mr. Trudeau is a majority prime minister, a minority prime minister, or whether Mr. Trudeau were to go.
All right. Well, Anne, you've touched upon the alliance for multilateralism a bit earlier in the conversation, and that's part of the solution of the troubles we are seeing now, which is invested by France, Germany, Canada, and many other countries around 70 nations. Why do you think that this type of international action is the future, and do you think it's enough to sustain multilateralism?
Well, there are two antagonistic forces at play in the world today. I mean, one of them is the forces that are for multilateralism and the forces that are for isolationism, nationalism, whatever you want to call it. And at this point, they seem to me to be almost equal, if you will. And so it will be a tug of war between the two. Has this crisis made it more possible, more likely that the forces for multilateralism are going to win the day? Is the Alliance for Multilateralism, which is a brand new organization, which really isn't even an organization yet, it's really a declaration of intent on the part of the two most prosperous European countries. It's a sign. It's a sign also that Europe wants to have greater say in its affairs because of the United States' constant withdrawal from the scene. Somebody has to take up the mantra, and I'm not sure that the organization as such has a future. It's not structured yet, and it will have to be. And as soon as it is, then it will fall into some of the usual bureaucracy pitfalls. but it could bring in some new blood. For instance, a country like Canada, since we are, linked with Canada right now, could well play a major role because of it. It's a large country. It's what's generally considered like an Anglo-Saxon country, but it has very, very strong ties with Britain and France in particular, stronger than similar ties in the US. And it also has an extremely diverse population, as Colin was reminding us of earlier on, 40% Asians in Vancouver. So it is in touch with the entire world. And it is, as it were, neutral. And it could very well, for instance, in this particular case, I want to emphasize that we're really talking about only the COVID-19 crisis, but in this particular case, it could take the lead, which the United States obviously doesn't want to and cannot with a president like Trump. And so maybe it can prove to the world that the United States doesn't want to. Well, let's do without it, or without the federal government, as I said. Let's not, of course, sever our links with the United States, which can never be done anyway and should never be done. But let's work with California, let's work with New York, let's work with whatever state, and let's forget about the federal government and go on with our job of trying to collect as much data as we can in order to bring a solution, a medical, pharmaceutical solution to this crisis. And maybe they can pull it off.
Let me pick up the question from there. You've touched upon a point that's something very, very hard to address. I tend to believe that we are now facing this crisis of multilateralism because of a decreasing legitimacy of these institutions because of a lack of efficiency. Is this why nationalist attacks on multilateralism is so strong and so efficient, according to you, Leslie and Colin?
Sorry, can I ask you to clarify this specific word that you used? Because a lack of efficiency?
Yeah, efficiency.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
expectation of solutions.
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, a focus on multilateralism is the exception, not the rule. We all know this, and the 1990s were, the real exceptional, the very exceptional period. The Security Council would never manage to do very much before then, and we were all blown away when it initially did. So our commitment and our ability to work effectively through multilateral institutions has never been robust. It's sort of come and gone, depending in part on who's in charge, on what the global need is, and what the threat, right? What the scale of the threat is, and the U.S. in particular has never been a good multilateralist ever, even though it was, at the forefront of helping to create and, lead the ideas and certainly put money into a lot of institutions. It's never been a good multilateralist. It's frequently stayed on the outside, but when it stayed on the outside, in many cases, it's aligned with the dominant norms inside of, whether it's, UNCLOS is the classic example. Even at some points in time, it got closer to the International Criminal Court. That's clearly not the case right now, but it's always been an ambivalent multilateralist. So I think it's wrong to say that, it was one way and now it's another way. Both of those currents have been there. They will remain there. And so I think this is a very fluid moment in time. Multilateralism has also not always produced efficient solutions. It's really, really good at putting norms out there, at setting a sort of aspirational agenda, but it's taken states and any other number of private actors to shore it up. So I just, we need it. I'm completely committed to it. I think it's absolutely essential, especially in this crisis, but there is a lot happening. And then the other thing I would say is, don't overestimate, in the US context at least, and the US might be different on this dimension because it's so large and its people tend to be much more focused on what's going on inside the country. Americans are not, you can do the studies where you show, even under the Trump administration, that the majority of Americans still support American leadership, they still support NATO and any number of things. But the reality is they're not really that interested, because the dominant concern of Americans right now is are they vulnerable? And are their states going to open or close? And that's what people are divided on. The only debate that's dominating the space right now in the United States is whether state by state, whether the governors are making the right decision to reopen the economy or not. That is where all the energy is. Nobody's talking about the WHO. I mean, there's some people in Washington like me and my friends, but we are not the majority. We are nowhere close to the majority of the, and I mean very, very, very intelligent professional Americans are not talking about the WHO. They are talking about whether or not the schools are going to open, the economy is going to open, what the fiscal stimulus is going to be, what unemployment benefits are. There's a huge debate about whether or not unemployment benefits are set too high and are going to disincentivize Americans to go back to work when there is work to go. That's the debate. And so if a Biden administration comes in and has, you know, a fiscal stimulus and a get Americans back to work package, and there's a vaccination, and Oxford gets it with some international partnership, and Europe is leading a coalition around to put money in to make it available, Americans will follow so long as what's happening at home is taken care of.
That's thank you, Leslie, to recall our attention to the necessary alignment between national and domestic priorities and outlooks, and what we look today at multilateral priorities. Colin, do you believe that this issue of efficiency is the one key trouble that multilateral institutions are now facing, so that foreign powers can attack these institutions or destabilize them?
Well, I think by definition, multilateralism, because it is all, it is not terribly efficient, but it is also necessary. But we've been living, in a sense, through an interesting period in history of 70 years with this emphasis on multilateralism and a rules-based order. But historically, it's more concert of powers and spheres of influence, which is what the Chinese would prefer, and the Russians would prefer, and some Americans would prefer. So it is up to those countries like Canada and France who see the value, because our prosperity depends on this system. It's, you know, globalization has brought us this extraordinary trade, but on our own we couldn't manage it, but we do it collectively together. But it really is, in some ways, a freak of historical nature. So we're going to have to work very hard to preserve it, and it's not a sure thing. Again, it's historically, it's big versus small, and that takes us back to Thucydides. And if it's big versus small, big dictates to small, and it puts countries like Canada and France into the small nation, and that's why we have to strive to preserve and double down, in the sense of multilateralism. I'll just make one other comment. You know, Canada and the United States, and arguably Europe, were federations, and the kind of counterweight to the United States, is, as Leslie pointed out, is that, and was pointed out earlier, states working with provinces, working with, and we heard about mayors working together. That's something, a dynamic that we have not seen very often, but we may see more of. And I think that's something that's quite interesting, and acts as a kind of counterweight. We've seen it working well, I think, on climate. The Trump administration goes in one direction, but there's still a lot of action going on. The World Health Organization may not be working for all, but there's this open platform now for scientists, Chinese, American, others, to share. That may be how we get ourselves out of this fix.
Yeah, Colin, let me pick up there. You've touched something upon that is one of the key questions we are trying to address within the Open Diplomacy Institute. You seem to make to draw a strong parallel between the crisis of multilateralism and a crisis of federalism, as if supranational or superstate institutions, either way, either multilateral or federal, would be attacking the same way and facing the same distress. Do you confirm this is what you've said?
Yes, I mean, I think federations work best in dealing with diversity, in a sense. That's where the world is today.
Exactly.
It's diverse.
Exactly.
Anne will speak to this. She talked about living in Canada. I mean, the European Union is an experiment that we all want to succeed. the alternative was two very difficult wars in the last century. And as the ambassador knows, you know, we celebrate, we mark. We don't celebrate. We mark the anniversary of the Second World War this week, the victory in Europe. And there's a lot of Canadian graves over there that are testimony to when the system doesn't work very well.
Exactly. Well, if I may say so, Thomas,
sure.
I think what Colin is saying is basically also what I was saying. The United States is a federation, and it gives us the opportunity to deal with each and every one of the states, as I was saying earlier. And this is maybe a different way of approaching problems, but I think it has promise because of the diversity that Colin mentioned. There's going to be a diversity of solutions to all kinds of things now because there's so many new actors that have come into play. I mean, the NGOs, for example, play a very large role in almost any situation these days. And the possibility that we have to deal directly with the states, I think, has promise because with an administration like the Trump administration, there's very little that Europeans, for example, can do. But I would also like to say that with a new administration in the United States, I'm a little bit more, well, I think it's going to be, it's never going to go back to what it was like before. I mean, Joe Biden, if he's elected, which I personally very much hope, will certainly want to mend fences with the Europeans and with everyone else, although possibly not with China. But well, but it will not be like before. And there's been too much bad blood between the U.S. and the rest of the world. Some of it, as I said, justified. The rest of it not justified at all. So we have to understand that the Democrats, although they will be more aware of the necessity for alliances, they are also reluctant to. At least some of them are also reluctant to sponsor multilateralism. As Leslie said, the Americans were never very good at multilateralism. It was always, you know, isolationism or else multilateralism, yes, but at our beck and call. I mean, let's face it.
I'm curious about that specific point. We've seen in April that former international leaders convened early April to send a call to action to the G20 actual leaders to address the pandemic with health and economic global measures, as well as the response that they've decided before in the 28th financial crisis, but there was no response. So I'm asking this, and you've started answering that question. It sounds like multilateralism is now a gimmick of past leadership. Do you believe that it's still possible to create consensus among global powers to foster cooperation around the COVID crisis management, or is not anymore possible?
Well, as I said, the United States has been absent from a consensus. So, but the rest of the world has been largely in agreement, at least as concerns the methods to deal with the crisis, namely this lockdown. And actually, it's interesting as such to see how China started this, and everybody followed suit. I always say, if Bosnia-Herzegovina had the coronavirus crisis and had said to its inhabitants, we'll all lock down, nobody else would have followed suit. You know, it's also a sign that a great power, China, now which is now considered to be the second greatest power in the world, right or wrong in economic terms, decided to employ a certain kind of methodology, and everybody automatically assumed that this was the right thing to do. In the old days, it would have been the US who would have shown the way to, you know, to sort of deal with any major crisis. It hasn't been the case. So the question is, I mean, Leslie said something which was very interesting. She said the conversation in the United States doesn't run around the WHO or any other international organizations. That is true, perhaps, in everyday life. But if you read the American specialized press in foreign affairs, Brookings Institutions, Fareed Zakaria, or you name it, they are extremely worried about the American leadership in this crisis. This is an existential question for them. Where is our leadership? Has it slipped away from us for good, or is it going to come back? I think that's a question that very many American analysts are asking themselves.
Leslie, I'd like you to maybe address the question that Anne just laid out. Is there a serious concern in the U.S. about the country's leadership, and is there anyone to revive this leadership in the U.S. today?
Yeah, so there's clearly, and Anna's exactly right, there is a very rigorous, very serious, very ongoing concern in the US foreign policy establishment on the moderate Republican side and the moderate Democrat side, less so on the progressive side of the Democratic Party, over America's internationalism, and especially America's internationalism by working with other key partners and allies and friends. And there are many plans. In fact, earlier today I was on a call with the people who are working on the plans for the transatlantic relationship. GMF is leading a very large initiative on this with MSC, the Munich Security Council. So, there's a lot of thinking on this, clearly. But the point I was trying to make was that, for kind of people who aren't in foreign policy elite, which is a tiny part of, American life, they're concerned about leadership for sure. They're not so wrapped up in the international debate right now, but they would be if it became very clear that it was very central to their to the health of the economy and to the facility of the daily life. But again, I just would caution against two things. One is assuming that it won't change radically if a U.S. administration changes, and two is cautioning against this idea that America is missing. And let me just say some names: Bill Gates, Apple, Google. What has the European Union decided on its on its social data tracking app that it's going to use to try and facilitate a response to COVID-19? The last I looked, it was Apple and Google, not a local European app, for lots of reasons having to do with where that data would be stored. Michael Bloomberg, Mayor Garcetti. So America's a diverse place. Europeans know this in spades. And my view, my instinct, my very strong instinct, is that if Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, Wendy Sherman, and any number of other, Obama Democrats returned to the European stage and started doing the hard work of everyday diplomacy with their friends, because these people were, for better and worse, they've done this, right? They've done this for years and years and years. They were America's multilateralism. They're not showing up for the first time saying, hey, we're different. They're saying, oh my God, thank God we're back. And I just don't think that the average European leader is going to say, we're not interested in you. I just don't see that happening. Which isn't to say that, re-knitting the institutions in this new context isn't going to be incredibly different. Trade has changed dramatically. It had already changed, and COVID-19 raises the stakes, the pressure on states to invest in their critical infrastructure now extends to pharmaceuticals, and any other number of industries that Americans and Europeans will think need to be protected nationally. So will we reopen multilateral trade in a way that has the US and its European partners working together? I hope so. I hope that the argument will be we can have stockpiles that are shared across trusted allies that allow us to still reach for the best and the brightest and the most innovative and introduce competition. And then once we have that, we can talk about supply chains still being open. So I hope that we get into those kind of debates, and those are the debates and the proposals that are coming out of really serious thinkers that are hoping that they get greater access to the foreign policy, mechanisms after, after a change of administration, and they might not. But so certain things have changed a lot. But final point, it wasn't great before, right? It was much better on trade. it wasn't great on security. We romanticized, you know, we had Syria with 2011 and 2013 and still going on. And there was no great multilateralism on what's been before this, you know, the most devastating humanitarian, arguably most devastating humanitarian crisis in, you know, a neighborhood that's proximate to Europe. There was no great transatlantic multilateralism solving that problem. So I just think, again, we have to just be, the rhetoric is damaging. The attitude is destructive. And sometimes we read from that and, you know, the positive, wonderful speeches that we all long to return to from President Obama, but it didn't always translate into productive, efficient, effective multilateralism.
Thank you, Leslie, for making that strong point. Before we get to the questions of our participants, and again, I'm asking for you guys to start asking your questions over the chat. Let me turn back to you, Colin. Essentially, what Leslie just said is that the crisis of multilateralism we've just seen is the surface of the problem, which is echoing actually more in-depth tensions, especially around security, around climate, and around trade. You've been a Canada ambassador in charge of trade issues, including in the NAFTA negotiations. Can you tell us a bit more about the way you see that this tension can be eased on the long run, and if there is a chance that we can see the surface of multilateral institutions a bit more quiet because of easing tensions? Is there a chance we can ease tensions?
Well, if you look at the trade model, then you'd have to say yes, because it's, in order for us to fund all the things we want, healthcare, education, certainly a country like Canada has to trade. We're too small a nation to be able to generate the revenue we need for prosperity without trade. So we, the European Union, Korea, you know, we're highly trade dependent nations. The United States is different. It's a civilization. It could manage. So that is why we have a keen self-interest in multilateralism and a rules-based system, because rules are what levels the playing field between dictation from the big and the small having to take it.
All right. Well, we will turn now to the participants' question. We have a 30-minute round of Q&A possible. Some questions are already asked by the chat, but I would like to open the mic for those guys who want to ask directly their questions orally. Is there anyone volunteer? If yes, you can show up and raise your hand. I'll turn on the mic. Yeah, maybe Evdidesh, if you want to start, I'll open your mic and you will be speaking. Is it working for you?
Yeah, it's working, I think now. Okay, thank you. So my question would be, I mean, for everybody, but for example, for Leslie, the United States seems to have abandoned the principle of political continuity. And I mean by that, the fact that once elected, an administration respect the treaties and agreements that have been signed by the previous administration. And from a Canadian perspective, but also from a European perspective, I believe the United States is starting to become more and more unpredictable. And thus this begs the question is, how do you deal with a country, a superpower, a hyperpower even, that has been the main enforcer of multilateralism, and how do you deal with a country that is becoming increasingly unpredictable?
Thank you for the question, Leslie and Colin. If you may answer this question about political continuity.
I mean, so, you know, first I'll say I'm completely sympathetic, and I find it as an American who's lived in the UK for just over a decade, I find it devastating. I find it shocking and devastating and embarrassing how this current administration is conducting itself on the international stage. I find it horrendous, and I now find it grave in terms of its potential consequences. And there is no planet on which I would support this administration returning into power. And I consider myself an independent analyst who obviously as a human being has political inclinations, but this is beyond the pale. And I think a lot of people are very deeply concerned. I do think that there are reasons why, what he said has resonated with Americans, and there are some very serious issues and they need to be addressed by the next administration. But on the predictability and the predictability thing, you're right. That's part of the key part of multilateralism. It's absolutely essential. However, if you look at what, the big flagship things that Donald Trump walked away from hadn't gone through Congress. So they were quite easy to walk away from. He hasn't walked out of the Security Council. He walked out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which hadn't gone through Congress. He walked out of the Iran deal, which hadn't gone through, which there were mechanisms for him to walk away. It hadn't really gotten Obama didn't take the steps that he probably should have taken to make that deal much more resilient and much harder to walk away from. So it hasn't been a unilateral walking away from, in legal terms. And part of the problem is that because there's been so much polarization and partisanship in the United States, there's been a turn towards taking action through executive order rather than taking it through Congress, which is a much more, resilient, lasting mechanism for ensuring multilateralism. Having said that, the US, the US does do this, right? It goes in and out of things that it doesn't like. And that's not, it's new the way that it looks and it's new the scale, but it's not new for the US to be a bad multilateralist.
Colin, could you please go on this question about political continuity that is that we as Europeans and Canadians are facing?
Well, Donald Trump is I think unique. We've not seen anybody like him, but I would say that the checks and balances and the separation of powers in the United States, we're seeing a real test of it. And on balance, I think that the system is working to constrain. The system was designed to prevent a king, and Trump, I think, would like to be king, like Mr. Putin or Mr. Xi Jinping. But it's the courts have constrained him on things like migration. Congress constrains him. The states, as we've talked about, and mayors take a different view. So that's the test that the rest of us have to sort of try and put up with and work with. But I will say, I guess as a sort of a concluding comment, is that the multilateral system, which was designed by American presidents, works best when an American president leads, even if from behind. As Leslie pointed out, Obama wasn't always up front, and it didn't always work well, but it did at least work better. But it's not. It really is in deep waters right now because Trump simply doesn't do that, and we can't fill the gap. You asked me earlier, could Canada fill the gap? No, Canada can't fill it back. France can't fill the gap. I don't think the Alliance for Multilateralism can fill the gap. This system works best when there is a kind of benign leadership provided by the United States. But Mr. Trump has abdicated that, so that throne is empty.
Can I say one more thing on this?
Yeah, please. And then after we will turn back to
I'll say very quickly. There is a problem here, which is that if you look at, the US domestic economy from 1993 until it's now getting worse again. Inequality grew and it grew and it grew. And it's very clear that some of that was linked to the trade agreements that the United States entered into, not least NAFTA in 1994. So, I'm a good multilateralist. I think in general it's good, but it hasn't always been good for all people. And it clearly had a very significant impact on the power of unions in America and the role of manufacturing in certain states that are really core to the American electorate, but it also affected a lot of people. So multilateralism is great, but it means many different things. And you can't just assume multilateralism is good. It does have to actually look after ordinary people. And in the case of the US president, ordinary Americans.
Yeah, Annick, you had a question about alternatives to the US multilateral system.
Yes, I have. Can you hear me all right? Is it okay? Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas. And thank you very much to the three guests on this panel. I was wondering, I was checking, actually listening to you, as to the alternative multilateralism which is in existence today. I was checking what China was doing with the China and Russia, actually, were doing with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and COVID, how they were using some sort of soft power, and no surprise, they are supporting the United Nations and the World Health Organization, UNCTAD, every UN agency they can think of, meaning that Chinese leadership through the Chinese and Russian, but I'm thinking about China especially, of course, on COVID. China is using the Shanghai Cooperation Organization once more to try and address multilateralism from, shall I say, from the South, no longer through Western leadership. I was wondering, thinking about the Alliance for Multilateralism, which again is Franco-German, is Western leadership trying to fill in the gap for the United States, but is transatlantic allies, it's the same group. It's 1945, it's the New World Order of 1945, the Pax Americana trying to survive through its transatlantic allies. It's still Western leadership. Are there, and you were mentioning also that the G20 is not really answering to the call to step in and try and organize something and be efficient globally. Are any of you seeing any alternative to China's multilateral attempt at leadership right now, rising from the South, rising that is not Western leadership trying to aggregate Ghana, Chile, etc. I was checking which countries have agreed to aggregate around the Alliance for Multilateralism, which is a European initiative originally. There's a few of them. Mexico, not a surprise. Chile, not a surprise. But can the movement really become global and counter at the same time the absence of leadership on the part of the United States, which definitely is going to last even if Joe Biden is elected? I mean, Obama was refraining from leadership already. So it's going to be long term. And is this initiative, can it become global enough to counter China's attempt at stealing the Pax Americana, is the way I put it to my students, actually.
Anne and Colin, maybe to start with, would you like to address a question raised by Annick?
Well, I think it's an extremely important and good question that Annick raised. It's very difficult to answer, but I think what we are seeing on the horizon is a different world in many ways, and the Westerners, the so-called international community, which was us, basically, meaning the West, is going to have to, I think, adapt to a new reality where there will be 2 or 3 other major spheres that will operate perhaps independently or more independently of us, while of course having some interaction with us, because that is indispensable now. And by the way, we shouldn't confuse globalization with multilateralism. That's an aside, but globalization in trade is not necessarily, at least in my mind, the same thing as multilateralism, in the sense that multilateralism implies a sort of acknowledgement of a certain equality among everyone, whereas globalization is strictly trade, and you know, you have some countries that trade more than others, and so on and so forth. So to get back to what Annick says, I think she raises a very, very important question, and we are all grappling with that, because as China's power is undoubtedly rising, and as the center of this crisis started with them, we have to come to terms with China's place in the world, where it wants to be, where we want it to be, and where we will be vis-à-vis the rest of the world and vis-à-vis China? I really don't have the answer to that question, but I think I'm not sure actually that it doesn't overstep the framework of this particular debate tonight, but it is something that is extraordinarily important to analyze and to analyze at this point, and we'll be working on it for a number of years to come, I'm sure.
Colin, Canada is already at stake with the Chinese alternative to the Pax Americanas, Annex as phrased it. How do you read the way that Beijing is trying to impose its new rule-based order to the world, and especially to Latin America and Africa?
Well, just to go back first, I would concur with differentiation between globalism and multilateralism. I think that's an important point for listeners to keep in mind, that there is this difference, and we didn't want to blend the two. But in terms of being able to respond to the international crises, whether we're talking tsunamis or the crises like Ebola, the one nation that has the logistical capacity to do so is the United States. It's the United States military that are the first responders whenever we have a major international crisis. And that, I think, as we saw, for example, in Libya, when the French and the British were inclined, the Americans had to come in and to provide the ordnance. As a practical sense, that's just the way it is. The Chinese don't have that capacity. I don't think the Chinese have global aspirations beyond Belt and Road Initiative, which is very much mercantilist and trade oriented. Again, that differentiation between multilateral and global, and nor do I think the Chinese have that. I think they want to be, their sphere of influence, the South China Sea and their neighborhood, which they would see in terms traditionally of kind of vassals and tributaries. They don't look at multilateralism. You talked about the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. It's not like we see multilateralism. It's different, and I think that part of the problem we made when China came into the system is that we kind of assumed for at least a generation that they would become like us, that economic prosperity would result in democratization. In fact, we made an error there. We also failed to perhaps enforce some of the rules that we imposed upon others because we felt that, the Chinese would become just like us. That's not going to happen. The Russians aren't going to become just like us either. So as we reapproach multilateralism, be clear that if you create rules, you have to also enforce them.
Well,
yeah.
if I may say so,
I think to get back to Annick's question by asking this to Leslie, do you share Colin's point that to Colin's interrogations around the fact that Beijing may not have any global ambition, only mercantilist approach to the Belt and Road Initiative? Do you think that's right, or do you believe that they have an alternative system to the Pax Americana that they like to develop?
I mean, it is the $100 million question. I think it's a moving feast. And I wouldn't claim to have the answer. My sense is that it didn't start out that way, but that things change. I do tend to agree with the view that China is very much driven by its desire to be highly competitive so that it can thrive economically at home. But even if that's the drive, that does turn into, global ambition. And I think, the reason people are concerned in the US about China, those who are really engaged in watching, has a lot to do with the current period of leadership and there's always a concern about competition. That was always going to be there regardless. And I think the concern now is the fear and the feeling that the surveillance state is growing, that there's a sense of, the grave restriction on civil liberties and human rights internally. Obviously, the fact that Michael Kovrig was taken prisoner and is still in prison has really changed how the foreign policy establishment in Washington feels about China. That to them, he is one of them, and they feel that to be deeply, deeply symbolic and threatening. And that has, you know, taken a view on China and driven it for much further down. So you know, the global ambition question is, you know, it's sort of a subset of the questions that I think people are very concerned with. But you know, when it comes to, it becomes a distinction without a difference at some level, because if it's just about mercantilism and competitiveness, fine, but it's manifest in, you know, this is a very strong American view. It's manifesting Confucian institutes that are spying on students and, you know, trying to get access to private information in private companies and so that looks like, even if that's just about mercantilism, that looks like global dominance of one form or another.
Well, we've seen other raised hands. Jacques, you can turn on your mic if you want to ask your question.
Okay. Is it okay? Is it okay to hear me? Okay. Yes, I do understand our focus about the United States and speaking broadly about the G7. But I don't know if it's your feeling also that, in fact, long before Donald Trump and Putin has paralyzed the UN Security Council, and it was about Syria, but it was another topic, or has put into question the border of in Europe. So don't you think that one of the responsibilities of the undermining of the multilateralism is Russia?
Jacques, your mic was kind of weird, so I'm trying to translate your point. Your question is around Russia and the role that it has played in the collapsing of the multilateral system. That echoes one or two questions that were raised by the chat. So that's right. We've not been speaking about Moscow along the conversation. I'm turning to Anne, who has a good knowledge of the Russian policy, foreign policy. Do you think that Moscow also has a role and a responsibility in the current situation of multilateral institutions?
First of all, I'm not sure. I could not understand Jacques' question at all. So I'm a little bit lost. Do I have a very good knowledge of Russian? You maybe, but anyway, I have some knowledge. But so you're saying that I'm sorry, I really couldn't quite understand the question.
Sure, I'm repeating. Jacques was trying to ask to inquire around Russia's responsibility in the current state of multilateral institutions.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, we all know what Russia is trying to do. I mean, this is a complex question. I mean, we've been very tough on Russia. It has become very tough in return. This is something that's truly, I think, worthy of a debate in itself. There are voices in the United States that have come to realize that this constant emphasis on Russia's malfeasance, just as the emphasis on China's malfeasance, however real those are, is counterproductive, both for the United States and for the world, and that we should probably engage in a different type of diplomacy. I have myself advocated, as you know, for a new rhetoric in our dealings with other powers such as Russia and China. I mean, Russia has been very active, obviously, in trying to sow discord and so on and so forth. But we've been very active too in putting it down and alternatively making Putin, on top of the world and directing everything. When it rains, it's the Russians' fault. This is all. We are at a point in time and in the history of diplomacy, which is extremely low, let's face it. And we have gotten into the habit of using terrible words to talk about other leaders and other countries, however much they might deserve it. And this doesn't bring anybody anything good. So as far as Russia is concerned, it certainly doesn't help multilateralism, that's for sure. But we have put it, and it has put itself in a position where it cannot. So we can, for the time being, sort of discount it in a sense.
Colin, do you share Anne's read on the way that we have pressured Russia at the late 90s and early 2020 decade that is now leading Russia to be part of the problem around multilateral institutions? Do you believe that Russia has no single-on responsibility around the situation?
I generally share. I think that we've not handled Russia very well. I think that we do need to change the rhetoric. I do think we should find some way to engage. But I also think that Putin has played a weak hand particularly well in places like the Middle East. He doesn't have a lot. You know, his oil revenues are in big decline, but he does have a lot of bombs, and he has a pretty powerful military force. But I think we've got to find a better way to engage. I think that President Macron is probably closer to the mark than some of the other leaders. But it's I would defer to Russian experts on this.
Yeah, let me turn to Leslie around this question. Do you think that if we change the rhetoric we have had towards Russia, there is a chance that Russia is now being part of the solution around the state of multilateral institutions, be part of the reviving of multilateralism?
No. I'm very skeptical about Russia right now. I mean, no, there are clearly things that, need to be done for any country, and absolutely for Russia, to enhance its sense of security. But I think, Putin has decided to be a spoiler as much as he possibly can, both in the region, on the borders, and internally, in the US and across European electoral and other democratic systems. And I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. So, no, I think he's somebody to be managed and contained, but brought fully in as a card-carrying member of the liberal multilateral establishment. No, I don't see it. But
right. Let me pick the last question from Jean-Baptiste points on the chat. He's asking about the role of the European Union in this whole mess. How I like you to be in that position, to be facing tonight the president of the European Commission, who Ursula von der Leyen. She's willing to be leading a geopolitical commission and to strengthen multilateral system. What would be your advice to help her achieve that goal before we wrap up? Maybe starting with Colin?
I'd tell her to double down on diplomacy and show great patience.
Patience. All right. Anne, what's your pick?
I concur absolutely with Colin.
Patience again. And Leslie, what would be your advice?
I think that, I agree, right? Clearly, diplomacy and patience, those are very serious comments. They're sort of dressed up with a smile, a very charming smile from both of my fellow panelists. And that is the number one thing. But I think, in terms of the policy, the China, Europe agreeing a way to work collectively to think strategically about China's ambitions in Europe, whether it's 5G, whether it's now on questions related to the pandemic, whether it's more generally on technology. I think Europe needs to cohere on this. And it also needs to find a way to work with the United States on this. And I know that this is not easy right now, but again, the game is not over in the US. And, you know, for better or worse, at the end of the day, we're all in it together. China's in it, and there's plenty of great things about China, and there's certainly tremendous things about the wonderful Chinese citizens who are living across all of our countries. But when it comes down to the value structure from the top, I think we're still more aligned in the West, and we should get on the same page, even when we have differences. And I think that geopolitical commission needs to really sort out Europe and the transatlantic community's approach to China on any number of dimensions.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for this last comment. Thank you, Colin, for being with us from Canada, and Anne from Paris. I would like to wrap up by thanking the whole team of the Canadian Embassy of the Open Diplomacy Institute for making this DiploLab possible tonight, especially Charles and Marie-Six, who are working every day and night to make it possible. We will meet again next week to talk about disinformation and information disorder, which is obviously related to the topic we had tonight. And since we are at the edge of a very specific weekend, I would like to recall the fact that this debate around multilateralism could not have happened without the help that we've received in Europe from our Canadians and American friends 75 years ago to put an end to World War II, which has led afterwards to the San Francisco Conference, laying out the basis of the UN. And also inspiring the 70-year-old declaration of Robert Schuman that was also paving the way for a European version or European fashion of multilateralism, which was the European Union, which is now turning 70-year-old. So thank you for you, the three of you, for having us tonight, and thank you all participants for your presence. We will meet next week with the ambassador Henri Verdier, in charge of digital affairs at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as Camille Grenier, a fellow of the Open Diplomacy Institute, who is working at Reporters Sans Frontières about the information and democracy project that was actually part of the Alliance for Multilateralism projects last year at the UN General Assembly, and other experts around disinformation and information disorders. Thank you everyone for being with Open Diplomacy and the Embassy of Canada tonight, and be safe around the confinement, as we say in French. Goodbye.
Merci, and thank you.
Merci. Au revoir. Au revoir.
Au revoir tout le monde. Thank you everyone.